Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back after a brief hiatus to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring some of the human risks posed by emerging technology. If that sounds like an oxymoron, bear with me, because my guest on this episode, Kate Jones, has some interesting insights into how emerging technologies like the Metaverse and artificial intelligence could, if left unchecked, have major impacts on some of our most basic human rights. Kate is an associate fellow at Chatham House, an independent policy institute. Having begun her career as a government lawyer, she became a diplomat before developing an interest in human rights and emerging technologies. In her research, Kate explores topics such as governance of new tech, the ethical implications of artificial intelligence, and the prevention of online harms and political manipulation. What she has to share is both terrifying and fascinating. You'll already be aware of the risks posed by overpowerful tech companies who have huge amounts of our personal data and know how to grab our attention and spread misinformation. But wait till you hear about the risks posed by even more immersive technologies. I first came across Kate thanks to an article she'd written entitled, "Without Regulation, the Metaverse Will Be Like Social Media on Steroids." She grabbed my attention, because from a human risk perspective, new technologies like the Metaverse are both exciting in that they offer us new opportunities for training, creativity and collaboration, but they can, and often do, bring out the worst in some of us. Whether your job involves managing human risk, in which case this kind of technology is going to play an increasing part of the risk profile, or you're just interested in how technology is going to impact our lives, what Kate has to share is fascinating. Before we begin, an apology, the audio is slightly distorted. I've tried to do what I can with it, but as ever, I hope that lower quality audio is more than compensated for by incredibly high quality insights. So please enjoy, as I know you will, my discussion with Kate Jones on human risk in emerging technologies. Kate, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you, Christian. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm really excited because we're going to talk about something that absolutely fascinates me. But before we do that, can you just tell my listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yes, absolutely. So I work in human rights and technology, emerging tech. I came into this area by an unusual route. I was a government lawyer for many years with the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, so my specialism is in public international law and human rights law. I then spent a few years at the University of Oxford, where I actually led a master's programme on diplomacy. But while I was there, I developed a research interest in human rights and emerging tech. Why? Because it's just such a fascinating intellectual challenge of our times. And so I really wanted to work on it. I really wanted to see how we can make governance of emerging tech work for everyone as tech develops so quickly.
Wow. I think very often when we think of careers, you start down a particular path and that's what you become. And so I really love this idea that you've been taken by something that I think is not necessarily immediately obvious to everybody, but actually, as we'll come on to explore, I think the question of sort of rights and what does risk and governance with new technologies, and particularly with the metaverse, I think is fascinating.
Yeah, you're right. It has been a story of transition. There's been one transition in terms of issues, moving to look at technology, and there's also been a transition in terms of who I work for, because I've gone from working for a very large organisation, the British government, and then a university, to essentially working for myself, and therefore carving out a niche in topics that interest me, and being able to sort of pursue my intellectual challenges for myself, which has been fantastic. I'm very privileged to have been able to do that and to turn my attention, as I say, to challenges which I think are really important for our time.
Let's talk a little bit about the metaverse. And for people who aren't familiar, I'll put some links to this in the show notes. In very, very simple terms, this is taking the internet out of the 2D world, things on screens, into a more 3D immersive world. And so that brings in virtual reality, augmented reality, cryptocurrencies, a whole load more things, some of which we sort of understand, some of which I think are still to develop. And of course, what the metaverse means is very open-ended. Everybody knows that Mark Zuckerberg has changed Facebook's company name to Meta to try and own that space, but it's much more than just that subject. And so I've been fascinated by this because I think any new technology brings with it opportunities and risk. And I think one needs to understand that. And I think as we've seen with technology in the past, particularly social media would probably be the best example, there can be unintended consequences if one doesn't understand it early enough. And so I find this really interesting because I'm fascinated by, one, how one thinks about the opportunities and the risks it poses. And secondly, because I think it's very exciting. And I think it's something that anybody in the risk governance space needs to be aware of. And if you want to be in the room when the conversations are happening, I think it's important to be there early on. But I'm also just a little bit of a tech geek. So I will confess, Kate, to having bought one of those headsets and playing games and doing various virtual reality things just to see. And I have to say, it's incredibly engaging and immersive. So I think from a training perspective, actually very interesting. Because one of the things that occurs to me for some of the listeners on the show is if you're in compliance and you want people to pay attention to your training, stick a headset on them and they can't do anything else. You can't escape and do your emails on the side. And so I think it has tremendous opportunity to make things feel like real life and really engaging. So on the positive side, on the downside, I think it's potentially a little bit too create some interesting consequences. So I've been on a fascinating voyage of discovery, which is how I came across you. And you've written a wonderful piece on governance in the metaverse. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit around that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, first, I really like it that you're talking about the example of training in the metaverse, because I think a lot of people think, oh, the metaverse, that's all about gaming, isn't it? But as you say, it offers tremendous potential for all aspects of our lives. And I think just as 20 years ago we would have found it hard to imagine the social media environment we live in today, so it's hard for us now to imagine the VR, virtual reality and augmented reality worlds that we might live in 20 years' time, where the metaverse is a reality of our daily life. But as you say, Mark Zuckerberg has invested enormously in the metaverse. A lot of companies are investing tremendously in the metaverse, and this may well be a way that technology is heading. And the reason that I became interested in it was because, as you say, I like to think about risks and governance. So there's all this excitement about the great things that the metaverse can do for us, but very little discussion as yet about how it should be governed. And the challenge of the metaverse is that everything that we've seen in social media, both good and bad, may be magnified in the metaverse. So what do I mean about that? Well, there's concern, for example, on the national security side, that social media may be a training ground for terrorists. Imagine how much stronger a potential training ground terrorists may have if they're able to recruit people in a VR or AR environment. That's one example. Or imagine harms. So in the UK, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about harms online, which we can discuss later, including, for example, harms to children when they're exposed to pornography and adult content that isn't suitable for them. Well, imagine being exposed to that, not just in written form and not just in the form of videos that you see online, but actually being immersed in it in a metaverse environment. And if we think that porn at the moment is doing a lot of damage to children's emerging sexuality, how much more exaggerated is that likely to be in the online context? And then content moderation and the challenges of what people see and how people get swept up in things, again, exaggerated. And finally, we have all of the issues about monitoring of people's behaviour and monetization of the data that is obtained through that monitoring, which are likely to be exaggerated in the metaverse. Because on social media, as you know, social media companies often monitor our reactions to things. They monitor what we like, and then they make money out of that by sending us targeted ads, or political organisations can again feed off that by sending us more ads on things that we like. Well, in the metaverse, the risk is that is exaggerated, that the providers of the metaverse can not only see what you are clicking to like, but they can monitor your facial expression as you do things. They can monitor your hand gestures as your avatar moves in virtual reality. And so they can really pick up a very detailed picture about you, potentially. And again, there's the potential to use that for monetization or for other ends. So The question is, this isn't necessarily sinister, it's only sinister if it's not governed, right? So the question is, how do you govern it? So what I have tried to do is to point out the fact that this isn't really being addressed and indicate that we need to be thinking about governance of the metaverse. And that starts with the law. So if you're in, let's say, a virtual reality world that you've gone into through a headset and you've got an avatar who is walking around in this world, what laws apply to you? Is it the laws of the country that you are from? So let's say I'm in the United Kingdom. Is it the laws of the UK that will govern what's happening to me in the metaverse? Or is it the laws of the United States as the country that has, of the company that's created this particular metaverse that I'm in? Or is it some other law? And is it actually the laws of the real world that apply in the metaverse? So we've seen allegations of crime already on the metaverse. We've seen at least one person has alleged that they've been raped, for example, in the metaverse, to take an extreme example. Well, do the laws of rape of the United States or the UK or elsewhere apply to virtual rape? Or do we need new virtual offences? And the same for groping, and the same for theft. If your avatar is collecting things or has bought things in the metaverse and somebody else comes and takes them in the metaverse, do laws of theft apply, or do we need new laws on that? At the moment, you've got this pretty unregulated environment, and all you have got is the terms of service of the companies that are establishing each of these metaverses which apply. But is that adequate? Generally, companies don't have a mandate, an elected mandate to govern in the public interest. It's governments that do that. So what do we need and how do we get there? Those are the kind of questions that I'm asking.
Wow. And it's fascinating because on the face of it, you would sort of think, well, what's all the fuss about? And then you start to unpick some of these examples. And for people that haven't experienced it, none of that is far-fetched. All very plausible, feasible challenges. And if that's just where we get to by thinking about it a little bit, and at the early days of this could get a lot more extreme. And so what I think is really interesting is you're starting to grapple with something that's there. And the one thing we know for sure is that self-regulation is not going to solve this. We cannot rely on those companies to do this themselves.
I think that's right. I think that's what we've seen from social media and from other environments, right? It's not legitimate and it's not really fair to expect companies to solve this for themselves. As I said before, we have governments who we elect public interest. Companies, quite legitimately, have a mandate to make money. Now, that doesn't mean that companies are sinister, and they may well want to set up things that are trustworthy in order to help them make money. But ultimately, it isn't their mandate, and they don't necessarily have the information to be able to govern in the public interest. So what we've seen, for example, with social media is governments trying to play catch-up with what happens online. So that has some disasters in the 2016 election in the United States, for example, in order to start making things better. And the infodemic on COVID-19 would be another example. So what I'm suggesting is that ideally governing with the metaverse as an example and say, okay, what systems do we use now in order to regulate for the future? And of course, it's difficult for governments to do that because they can't see exactly what the risks are. And so, therefore, what we are seeing is governments beginning to adopt more of a risk-based approach. So rather than saying this, and this are harms, and these are things that can't be done, instead saying, okay, companies assess the risks of, for example, breaches of human rights happening, and then they need to report on those risks, and they need to take steps to mitigate against those risks. And I think that's a sensible approach. We see that, for example, in the Digital Services Act, which is coming in the EU, which is regulating social media, and we also see it as in the draft EU Act on artificial intelligence as well. So you could see that being rolled out more generally, I think, in the tech sphere.
And of course, one of the things that's interesting about this is you will get this global impact of, so for example, what's known as the Brussels effect. So if something is implemented by the EU, if that standard is higher than standards elsewhere, that may well become the de facto global standard. On the basis it's easier to go to that. And particularly because it's difficult for all the reasons you've identified, it's difficult to start to delineate as to where what should apply. So it's possible that this could be solved by bodies like the EU or countries like the US who have huge amounts of influence setting a standard that then gets replicated elsewhere.
That's right. And the EU is doing fantastic work on regulation of our digital. A good example of what you're talking about is the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which was established by the EU and has had quite wide purchase around the world, because it sets some quite good ways of regulating our data. Some steps in that direction. And we have seen it being copied around the world, and we have seen a lot of companies moving voluntarily to adopt its standards internationally. So I think that may well be the case, as you say. In the UK as well, we have some interesting regulatory initiatives. Again, I think that if they are good, they may well be followed more widely than just in the UK. If they're not, then you might start to see the internet being carved up into chunks with different things happening in different countries. And that's, in the long run, that's not helpful for anybody.
And one of the things that is fascinating about the metaverse at the moment, as opposed to the internet, so there's obviously the dark web, which is a slightly different piece, but generally speaking, the internet is an open access area, whereas what we have at the moment is various organizations building up. So Facebook or Meta has created its own metaverse, and there are competing universes out there. So we don't yet have that thing that you have when if you log into a web browser, you can get to all of the standard websites. At the moment, you need to have, in some cases, you need the specific hardware. So in the case of the Meta world, you need to have their specific headset to be able to get into their metaverse. There isn't that interoperability with them. And so the world that you're pointing towards is potentially, we think of it as one thing, but actually at the moment, it's a series of disparate universes that will, I suspect, come together in some form. But we could well have different worlds and different standards, is what you're saying.
Yes, that's right. And I think you can see the commercial reasons for that. These are worlds that are developing in competitive environments, and for good reason. There are lots of risks in that. So again, thinking about social media as an analogy, we've seen the challenges when some platforms ban certain content or ban certain people from being active on those platforms, and then you see that content of those people pop up on different platforms. So you're not actually removing it, you're just moving it into a different sphere and a different circle. And that can be equally challenging. And that's another reason why you need regulation at the level of governments rather than just at the level of individual companies. I think it's quite legitimate for companies to set themselves up in different ways. So, for example, one company to say, okay, all of our services are going to be child-friendly, and so we're not going to have content that isn't child-friendly on our platforms or in our virtual reality world. So that's fine to have that kind of differentiation, but it's really governments that ought to be setting the floors for what's acceptable. And ideally, they would do this in ways that companies subscribe to as well, because then, I mean, I imagine from the perspective of somebody inside one of these companies, trying to work out what you need to comply with is an absolute minefield. Really hard for them if each country's got different laws and there are different standards all over the place, and indeed people have different ethical ideas of what should be complied with. So the more that you can actually get unified baselines on these things, the better for everybody concerned.
And of course, it's fascinating when you look at technology meeting regulation. One constrains the natural impulses of the other. And so we've seen a sort of a tech logic of move fast and break things. And of course, if you're just coding something, that can make perfect sense. The moment you're coding something that has societal implications, so if we think of financial services, where you can't just create things, there's a structure around it for very good reason. There will be other environments in which, again, you need to be very, very careful of the implications. So this is, I think, a really interesting natural tension between tech tendencies of let's try these things out and see what happens, and the ability to pivot and move quickly, versus actually regulation, which quite rightly wants to constrain the impact of things when they have a societal significance.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's very well put. I think what we're seeing at the moment is, as you say, tech companies have moved fast, tried to break things. It's the spirit of innovation, fantastic. And then more recently, particularly in larger companies, the emergence of ethics teams. And the growth of those ethics teams, trying to put some principles and some limits around what's being done. You may have seen, for example, that Microsoft announced a couple of weeks ago that it was going to cease to include emotion recognition in some of its work. So this kind of carving out of limits around these. And I think that's challenging for a wide range of reasons. One way in which it's challenging is that each company is doing their own thing, trying to work out their own ethical limits. So in the field of AI, which is another area that I've been researching, there are, at the last count, something like 230 separate sets of principles on AI ethics that have been developed by companies or international organisations or civil society, and they're all different. So everybody seems to agree that AI ethics is a good idea, but everybody has a slight version of what that is. And so that really brings me to sort of the centrepiece of my work, which is on human rights. So if I if I have looked back to the 1940s, we had obviously had terrible, terrible conflict. A lot of people had lost their lives. A lot of people felt they were staring into an abyss of human morality. And there was this big upswell of support for the idea of human rights. That human rights were something that we're going to protect, both against those kind of atrocities happening again, but also in terms of allowing decency, of allowing normal life, led by decent principles. But when you asked people what they meant by human rights at that time, they all had slightly different ideas. And it's just like ethics at the moment. Everybody thought it was a really good idea, but nobody knew exactly what it was. And so it took quite a lot of time and a lot of work across countries between different governments and experts and so on to actually agree first the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and then all of the human rights treaties we've had coming out of that. And I feel as though we're in quite a similar situation with ethics at the moment, particularly in the AI field. And what troubles me as a human rights person is that in that debate on ethics, human rights is often being overlooked. And I think there are various reasons for that. I think sometimes people think, oh, human rights is old-fashioned. As I say, it's something from the 1940s rather than from now. I think that in some domains people think that human rights is radical. Human rights is what's being used to stop people being deported to Rwanda. It's not what is about protecting the fundamental freedoms of you and me on a daily basis, although it actually is. I think that amongst companies, there may be a feeling that, well, human rights doesn't really apply to us. Human rights is about government. But actually in 2011, the UN agreed unanimously that companies do have a responsibility to respect human rights in their activities. I think sometimes there can be a worry that human rights means accountability, whereas if you set up some ethics principles for yourself within your company, those probably don't come with any accountability. And so all of these things come together for people to think, oh, well, it's not really about human rights. But actually, human rights is about the essence of what it is to be human. And human rights is this agreed set of norms. There aren't 230 different versions of what human rights is. There are, of course, different interpretations between states, and human rights law permits that. But actually, with human rights, you've got this codification of a set of ethics into a set of norms that's then been thought about and developed over the last 75 years, and actually isn't extreme, actually offers you a really important way of balancing rights and interests in different circumstances. So when you get new situations, like, say, the Metaverse or social media or AI, it isn't a matter of saying, oh, well, freedom of expression means this. It's a matter of saying, okay, freedom of expression means that you balance people's right to speak freely and to access information freely with the other essential interests that may be concerned. And the same with some rights are unqualified, but quite a lot of rights are qualified. And you have this quite subtle balancing test so that you see whether the infringement on any right is actually proportionate to what you're trying to do. So let's say facial recognition, for example. Human rights doesn't mean no facial recognition, just as human rights doesn't mean no innovation. What it means is that if you are thinking about deploying facial recognition technology, you need to look at the other human rights and interests that engages and see whether the benefits outweigh the risks and the challenges of that. It's quite subtle. And it worries me that human rights are somehow being overlooked or not looked at adequately as we think about the regulation of tech.
And do you think the human rights movement is helping that? Because I'm really struck by, on the one hand, you explain it, and we all, you sort of think, well, that sounds really good, right? These basic principles that we ought to have. And actually, you see lots of examples of people sort of saying things like, I know my rights. And so we're all equipped with this sort of basic understanding. And yet, and I'll be slightly extreme in what I say now, it feels like for some people it's quite toxic. Something to be almost sort of to be denigrated and to be avoided, and we don't need any of that. We don't need any of that nonsense. And I wonder, do you think the human rights movement is helping in this regard?
Yeah, I think two elements of toxicity. I think it's a great question, and it's one that the human rights movement really has to think about. And I think there are two elements of toxicity. The first is a particular UK problem that the Human Rights Act came in to force in this country in 2000. It wasn't accompanied by any kind of public education campaign about what human rights is, and instead we've had a diet from sections of the media over the last 20 years where human rights has been blamed for example, not being able to deport terrorists or for prosecutions of the military and things like that. There's been quite a blame culture towards human rights, and some political factions have jumped on that as well. And that does make it hard to talk about human rights at the moment in this country. And yet also you've got bodies that champion human rights, such as the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which have been woefully underfunded. So you haven't really got human rights champions. So that's a political issue specific to the UK. But I think more generally, the human rights movement isn't really helping itself because it sometimes is perceived to take extreme positions on issues of new tech that aren't doing it any favours. So to take an example, when I first started looking at human rights and emerging tech, it was about disinformation. And I was quite concerned in the aftermath of the 2016 US election, the Brexit referendum, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, about claims that freedom of expression meant that there couldn't be any or much content moderation online, that we basically couldn't do anything about disinformation, that it was a phenomenon that we just had to accept. And there was a sort of a challenging alliance at the time between companies who obviously didn't want to get involved in moderating people's expression, and then some of the human rights movement who were arguing very, very strongly for freedom of expression. And so when I looked at this, I thought, well, hang on a second, freedom of expression is really important, don't get me wrong, but so is our freedom of thought and opinion. The ability in an electoral context to be able to make up your own mind is essential, so not to be manipulated in how you're thinking about politics. Similarly, privacy is really important. Similarly, in that context, the right to vote is really important. And so what I started to argue for was, well, when thinking about disinformation, we don't just need to be thinking about the content of what's being put online, but we need to be thinking about manipulative tactics that are used online. So the use of fake accounts, the use of bots, the way that content becomes amplified in an artificial way, such that people start to think that something quite extreme is actually normal because they're seeing it over and over again, or because they're seeing people agree to it because they've been manipulated into agreeing with it. Since that time, I think that view has become much more widespread, that manipulation is something to tackle. We see, for example, Facebook tackling coordinated inauthentic behaviour. We see the EU, again, has done fantastic work with the European Democracy Action Plan, and they do other work as well to try to counter particularly foreign interference, but other manipulation online. And we see also more generally a discussion about how content is amplified online and how the algorithms of social media companies amplify content, and a concern that simply amplifying the most shocking content, because that goes viral most quickly and therefore makes most money for the companies, isn't necessarily the best way to manage our information environment. And the infodemic that we saw around COVID was quite a catalyst on this, because people saw that actually digital literacy wasn't enough to deal with all of the rumours online and all of the false information that was really scary for human health that was being put out online. So that's an example of the human rights movement having to say, okay, freedom of expression is important, but so are other things too. And I think, another example I would give is about, as I say, facial recognition. Sometimes you might see headlines saying, well, human rights says there should be no facial recognition. Well, actually, the situation is more subtle than that. If you're going to think about facial recognition, you need to think about in what circumstances you're using it, what the interest is, if it's going to be used by the police, what should be the parameters around that to make sure that it's only used in such a way that it is really tackling security issues and crime issues, and not just recording data about lots of people, for example. So human rights needs to be subtle, and I think the human rights movement needs to sort of come into that subtlety in addressing these challenges.
And do you think that's feasible? Because it strikes me that a lot of the extreme views on it, particularly the ones you cited in the UK, for example, in many cases, that's quite a difficult thing to unpick. So even if it's trod more lightly, there's quite a lot of headwinds to overcome, for want of a better phrase.
Yes, that's right. My friend, the late, great Lord Lee Lester, saying to me, well, human rights is like a pendulum. It swings from one side to the other. And just because there is a culture in the UK of unhappiness with human rights at the moment, that doesn't mean it's going to endure. Well, I have to say, it was many years ago that he said that, and the pendulum is still over there, which does make me worry. So I think that is a challenge.
It sort of occurred to me that the answer to the first part was potentially around branding, and maybe it's just the phrase that, because actually when people see the realities of it, it's something that when it works for you, it's very appealing. And so one of the things that struck me that potentially the term itself isn't necessarily helpful. That definitively doesn't solve the second issue that you outlined.
Yeah, absolutely. And so here we come back to this term ethics, which currently seems much more politically palatable. The British government's work in this area is couched in terms of ethics, and similarly internationally, including companies. And I was talking to somebody recently who was involved in drafting an algorithmic impact assessment for the British government. So that's an assessment of the compatibility of AI with ethical principles. And she was candid that it's called ethics because that's a much more palatable term to use than human rights. And that the lawyers that they consult on their work are not ethics lawyers. That's an oxymoron. There's no such thing as an ethics lawyer. They're human rights lawyers, right? So that's absolutely right. So branding may be an aspect of this, and that's fine. If people prefer to call it ethics, that's fine, as long as we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater and forget all the good of human rights at the same time.
And that point you made around ethics and algorithms, I mean, that is fascinating. And I could sort of, as I think about what technologies are capable of doing and the decisions that it's already taking on our behalf, and you pointed towards social media algorithms, but there are lots of other situations where these things are starting to be deployed, with all the challenges of what are we programming to do, what data sets are we putting in, all of those sorts of decisions. I mean, this is a sort of, you sort of said, somebody was looking at this. That's one heck of a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. It is one heck of a challenge. So, as I mentioned, you've got all these ethics principles out there. And now, the stage we're in now in the intelligence world is companies saying, okay, how do we make these principles realizable so that they actually affect how software is developed and used? And there are different ways that seem to be merging of doing this. One of them is audit, so kind of ethics audits. There's potentially a whole new industry here in AI assurance. That's something that the British government is keen on, and on auditing. And then another way that this is termed is algorithmic impact assessment. So that's essentially looking at what impact algorithms would have before they come into service. You're trying to implement those principles you've got. And looked at from a human rights perspective, again, this is quite positive. In the human rights world, we have ways of doing this called due diligence and human rights impact assessment. It's quite similar, except that there are a couple of deficiencies that we're seeing in these impact assessments. One of them is that stakeholders are not being consulted enough on what AI, let's say you're going to roll out an AI system that's going to, I don't know, decide on welfare benefits. So discuss with stakeholders what impact this system will have before it comes in. Secondly, because this impact assessment is often being done by software developers, they're trying to do it at the design stage, and that's great. But doing things at the stage when you design your AI isn't necessarily enough. And take discrimination as an example of that. Let's say you've got your great big data set from which you build an AI system that's going to decide, I don't know, let's say it's going to make some filtering decisions in a recruitment process. And so you sort of tweak your design system so that you say, okay, we're going to filter out, if we can, any discrimination on the basis of gender or any discrimination on the basis of race and so on. The problem is that even though you've taken your best efforts to do that, the system may still exhibit signs of bias when you bring it into life. And that's what's been shown to happen with companies when they have brought in these systems to a certain extent. So what you need is not just looking at bias at the design stage, you also need to be monitoring for bias once the systems come into operation on a continuing basis. And that reflects the fact that the notions we have of discrimination are very contextual. And where you're deploying AI, it's in context. It's not just on a page. It's how it actually applies in the real world. So any kind of algorithmic impact assessment needs to have this ongoing capacity to look for bias and for other rights violations or ethics violations, if you like, to make sure that it's actually compatible with our principles. Getting that right will be really, really important as AI becomes more widespread.
And of course, the interesting thing I always think is that the reason you're giving it to an algorithm is it's a big problem. And therefore, if you've got bias built in to the way it thinks or to the data sets that you're putting through, you run the risk through the audit approach, of course, that you'll spot it once it's already had a major impact. And so because of the scalability of these things, and it's precisely when you can scale it, when you want to scale it, when you introduce them, that's a little bit of a challenge. So the logic of we need to stop this before it goes live makes a lot of sense because the potential implications are huge. So in other words, it's highly scalable risk. And so to a certain extent, what you're pointing towards there is to say, well, actually, it's impossible to identify before it goes live. So we're going to have to be very alive to it once it does. Because if we're not, logically, it could scale up very, very quickly. And so we might spot it, but by then, lots of bad decisions will have been made.
Yes. In short, yes, exactly. So you need to be screening for it at the outset, but then also on a continuing basis. And as you say, if that risk of scale up rapidly is a major one, you might want to think about deploying slowly in order to be able to look for these risks before you have the very wide-scale deployment. Yeah. But all of this is really under exploration at the moment. So in the Netherlands, they've recently brought in some algorithmic impact assessment, and as a result of it, they've had to withdraw quite a few of the algorithms that they had brought out in the public sector that were making benefits decisions and so on, because they were found to not be consistent with ethical principles. So that's just an example of the scale of the challenge that there is at the moment. And there is a real risk that AI that's been brought out already is going to be found not to meet ethical principles. Another challenge in this area is about technical standards, because what you tend to have is a system where you have rules on the outside and then technical standards that kind of give meat to those rules within. And in the past, technical standards, developed by engineers have tended to be quite practical. Let's standardise our shoe sizes, or let's standardise these plugs, or look at the wires in front of me, and I can see it says complies with BSI something or other. Technical standards. Suddenly, ethical standards are having to dip their toe into ethics, because we're now looking at technical standards for ethical implementation of AI, or ethical standards for facial recognition or emotion recognition, etc., etc. And so engineers and others in technical standards bodies are suddenly finding that they're having to get engaged with ethical issues much more that's in the past. So another strand of my work has been trying to say, okay, technical standards folk and human rights folk need to talk to each other much more and understand each other's worlds because otherwise, again, you're putting quite an unfair burden on the technical standards side, and things risk going wrong.
And that's interesting because that it sort of occurs to me that problem has always been there. So if we look at, for example, Caroline Criado Perez's Invisible Women as a good example, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes for anyone that's not read it, highly recommended, that looks at this challenge of, there is a lack of data on women. And so we've had things like bulletproof vests being designed around a man's body, not a woman's. So to a certain extent, what you're saying is it's more obvious to us, but it's always been there. But this is potentially even worse because of that scalability point.
Absolutely. So tech amplifies, and that is the problem. It amplifies all of the biases that we have already in so many different ways, unless you actively mitigate for them. So if you are using data sets, again, say to decide on to help you decide with recruitment, and those data sets have been biased in favour of men or in favour of white people, then that bias will come through in how your algorithm operates. And it may not be as obvious as that, but let's say you're training your algorithm and it's looking at CVs which have been largely put in by men, and those CVs tend to be crafted in a slightly different way from CVs written by women. You may then get the same bias appearing, right? So it's not necessarily all that obvious, but it will still be there. And that's absolutely a problem that is cropping up all over the place. And what's more, that's one set of the bias. Another set of bias is about, okay, who is developing AI and who are they developing it for? And at the moment, most artificial intelligence is being developed by commercial companies for people who are prepared to pay a lot of money for it, right? It's a very commercial environment. And what that means is that environments where there isn't so much money around are losing out on development of AI that will benefit those societies. And that also means that you're likely to further entrench and develop inequality between aspects of society and between societies around the world. What we need is much more development of AI that is going to help implement the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, because AI has fantastic potential for all societies everywhere. For example, it can really help with equal food distribution so that food gets to where it's really needed, right? It has major capacity in the health sector, not only for the sort of diseases that we face here, but also for diseases that people face all over the world. It can be transformative. Education as well. AI can bring education to lots of people who currently don't get much education. So there's loads of scope there for AI to do good things. And the risk is that in the environment that we have, AI basically makes the rich richer and makes our lives more efficient, and does the opposite for people at the other end of the spectrum. So in lots of different ways, you risk entrenching and exaggerating bias that you have in society at the moment. Again, what can be done about this? Well, again, call me old-fashioned, but I look to governments to govern and to try and govern in ways that actually create societies that benefit everybody.
And can you talk a little bit, the term I read recently, which was fascinating, a new one on me, which was empathetic AI. Can you talk a bit about that and what that looks like in terms of these challenges?
Yes, absolutely. So we've got affective computing or emotional AI, empathic AI. Yes, I'm glad you raised that actually. So more and more has the capacity to do two things. The first is to actually, apparently, to monitor people's emotions. So looking at you now, Christian, the AI would determine whether you were bored, whether you are happy, whether you are looking forward to this coming to an end, whatever, whether you're laughing, and so on, and then can extrapolate from that. Now, there are lots of concerns about the science here, because we all know that we can have one expression on our face and something else that's going on in our mind. But there has been quite a demand, for example, from China in the classroom to monitor children's emotions to see how engaged they are with lessons. So that's one thing, is this idea of monitoring and then potentially surveillance of emotions. But the second dimension of this is AI that actually has capacity to demonstrate empathy. So in the same way that humans, when you want to forge a relationship with somebody else, you will show empathy, you will show you understand them, you might agree with them, you will ask questions that lead on from that. Now, computers are developing the capacity to do that. But that's not because they really understand us, and it's not because they're really empathetic, but it's because they are learning from so many trillion data points that they're able to provide a good facsimile in what they do. And you might have heard recently about the Google researcher Blake Lemoine, who was placed on leave after saying that an AI chatbot had become sentient, and he said it was like a 7-year-old child. Now, of course, that chatbot isn't actually sentient. Instead, it's extrapolating very accurately from all of these data inputs to look as if it's sentient. It's so successful that it appears to be mimicking human reasoning and emotion. Now, again, that creates lots of challenges in terms of potential manipulation of humans. Because if a computer can actually empathize with you and make you feel that it's your friend, it could lead you to do things in the way that a human friend could, potentially. So, again, what should be the guardrails around this? Now, there are lots of advantages in emotion AI and empathic AI. So, for example, at a very basic level, as of this year in the EU, all new cars are going to have to be fitted with technology that recognises driver fatigue and also driver distraction. And so things like anger will register and trigger a warning. Great. So that's a clear good thing. That's going to make all of us safer on the road. And also, for example, for disabled people, having assistive technology that is able to empathise and help people, again, great. But as I say, there are potential problems. You can see the problems for manipulation here. And at the moment, we don't have any normative framework for dealing with this. The closest framework we have is thinking about privacy, to the extent to which AI or other technology is allowed to monitor and surveil us. But we don't have a framework at all, again, to protect our freedom of thought and freedom of opinion, our human autonomy. So there are people working on this, and I think that this is a really important area to develop. Again, before it's too late. You really need that framework in advance before we're all being hoodwinked by our own devices.
And I mean, my mind is now racing. And by the way, my facial expression is entirely what I'm thinking, and I'm smiling and intrigued and happy. So just so we're clear on that. Yeah, I mean, this is huge amounts of work in progress. And this is pushing, I mean, a question, I guess, is this pushing the limits of our existing frameworks? In other words, is that a good proxy? Or are we really having to, I hesitate to say reinvent the wheel, but are we having to think differently about these things? Or can we take those basic principles that we've always used? And is there a reasonable degree that they're applicable?
In my view, privacy is an inadequate proxy. Because there can be times when AI can be empathic without actually getting any personal data about you. Should that be allowed? So just to give an example, there was a case in an election campaign, I think it was in Mexico a few years ago, where they had a billboard with a large advert for one of the political parties. And what that billboard did, a camera in it, it recognised people's emotions, apparently, and their facial expressions as they looked at this billboard. And then the billboard would change, the advert would adapt in order to get the most positive expressions in response to it, right? So it didn't actually take anybody's personal data. It didn't know who the people were that were looking at this billboard, but it was still using that data in order to keep improving itself. Now, query whether you think that's okay or not. Personally, I think it's risky because, again, it creates opportunities for manipulation. But the point is that we have no framework by which to discuss this, no framework by which to say, okay, this is acceptable, this isn't. We're really used to the idea of influence. We're used to nudge technology. You're used to the idea that you sign up for something for a month for free, and then it might be an absolute nightmare trying to cancel that subscription at the end of the month, and of course they're hoping you won't. Or the idea that, you get something quite cheap knowing that something else is going to come afterwards. Or the idea that you buy one thing and then you get adverts for similar products. So we're used to all of those kind of nudge technologies, and we don't see them as problematic. At the other end of the spectrum, it's not lawful to make misrepresentations in contract law. So you can't misrepresent what you're selling, for example. And as you know, in the UK, there's been a big clampdown recently on fake adverts online, although there are still a lot of them around. So we've got things that we see as acceptable and things that we see as unacceptable. But where's the dividing line between them? What is the dividing line between persuasion and influence, or inappropriate influence? And in the political spectrum as well, even more so, where's the dividing line between what politicians can legitimately say and what kind of ads they can use? Like, did you know there were apparently there were a billion pro-Brexit ads on Facebook in the UK in the run-up to the amendment, according to Dominic Cummings's blog, targeted different ways to different people. What's the line between what you can legitimately do and what isn't legitimate, and how do we find that line? As I say, I don't think we've really got a framework for talking about it.
And it's fascinating because I'm very tempted in those sorts of situations to decide what I think based on the circumstances. So though literally in simple terms, depending on who the politician is, what the message is. So I could draw one conclusion and say, well, public health, that in that situation we should be allowed to do X, Y, or Z. But obviously politicians, that's, or even political party A, because I agree with them. So this is very, very challenging in the sense that I think some of the other things, human rights, ignoring the fact that the brand is a bit tarnished, at least there we would have a basic understanding. Yeah, we think that makes sense in most circumstances. This is much more contextualized, much more challenging. And so I worry slightly when you talk in those terms that we have the capabilities to make these decisions, because this is stretching the bounds of the human brain. I mean, we if I looked at how would you regulate this, principles-based regulation is fraught with difficulty, but then codified regulation could also create some unintended consequences. This seems to be pushing the bounds of sort of lots of limits.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think taking a risk-based approach is quite interesting. But as you say, I think there are lots of issues here that haven't really. And the question is, again, how you work them through. And I've made no secret of the fact that I think there's a big role for government. But I think the challenging thing at the moment is that all of the money is on the commercial side. It's not just, and also the knowledge. So it's not just the tech that's outpacing governance, but it's also the financing, it's the research capacities, it's even the awareness of how the technology works. Government is far behind. What I would like to see, my ideal world on this, would be the creation of some kind of multi-stakeholder forum or platform where companies and governments could actually get together, probably financed by tech, to really hammer through some of these things. And you do see little pockets of this, but I would like to see that happen in a much more institutionalised way. I don't think it's fair for us to have to live in a completely unregulated environment, but I don't think it's really fair for companies to say, well, that's for governments to do, and meanwhile we're going to race ahead with our innovation. Actually, bringing them together and having a multi-stakeholder process is probably the way forward, and will probably help to overcome some of those jurisdictional challenges that we mentioned earlier on as well, the different rules in different countries. So that would be my ideal on this, on the empathic AI side, but also more generally on tech governance, would be to have much more cross-fertilisation of ideas and, much more formal fora on this. Yeah.
And it struck me as you were talking, I was thinking back to the times when Zuckerberg et al. Have appeared in front of Congress and Senate in the US, and the level of questions demonstrated such ignorance of the people. It was almost as a waste of his time being there. But also I was thinking, well, if these people are responsible for making decisions about legislation, this is terrifying because they don't even understand the absolute basics. And so I think this idea of cooperation, it makes a lot of sense because let's approach this and say everybody wants to try and do the right thing, because I think that one has to start there. But I think that's clearly the only way that this can work, because we need to bring both. We need to have a sort of level playing field in terms of knowledge and understanding. And I think so. I like that vision that you're pointing. Is that realistic?
Well, I think it could be. Everybody does want to do the right thing, at least to a certain extent. You get a lot of companies saying we want to build trustworthy AI, and you get a lot of ethicists within companies, I think, saying, we want to do the right thing, but we're not sure what the rules are. As I say, it might be mainstream use of emotion recognition. It's in its AI. Other companies aren't necessarily following suit because there aren't rules on this. So it is in everybody's interest. And I think in terms of political awareness and so on, it obviously varies between countries. But in the UK, for example, we haven't touched on the online safety bill, but you've actually seen a really good process of democratic debate on that bill, I think. Perhaps because it has been a little bit aside from the cut and thrust of party politics. There's overall support for the bill. But it's gone through a really good process. We had what's called a green paper in the UK, and then we had a white paper. They were both consulted on. And then a draft bill was put out for pre-legislative scrutiny, and there was an excellent joint committee that led work on that and put forward lots of recommendations to the government. And now we've got a new draft bill. So through all of that, there has been a process of taking account of the views of quite a wide range of stakeholders. It's just that it's quite slow. That bill, once it becomes an act, probably won't become law until 2024 at the earliest. And again, you've got this kind of slightly oppositional position of government on the one hand and companies on the other, rather than stakeholders coming together to actually sit down and say, right, how are we going to work out the governance of this stuff?
And is there a link with all of this to things like ESG?
Yes. So I'm not an ESG expert, but I think coming back to, that area, there is a really interesting scope here for investors and for the ESG world to be looking at this field much more closely. So what I see, for example, it includes Microsoft, Apple, Alphabet as its largest companies. And what I see as well is that on the ESG side, there don't really seem to be parameters for ethical investment in technology at the moment. It seems to be an underexplored area. Looking at the UN-backed principles for responsible investment, there doesn't seem to be anything there on ethics in technology governance. And actually, it's relevant to all three fields, to the ethics, to the environment, because the processing power of computers is something that can have very significant environmental effect. The social effect, of course, we've been talking about that a lot. And then the governance side as well. What are the governance processes on ethics in companies? And I think there's a real scope here for investors to be thinking about, okay, what should those parameters be for responsible investment in technology? And particularly with technology running so far ahead of governments, investors have got a real role to play in saying, hang on a second, these are the kind of ethical principles that we would like to see you following as you develop new technology, as you develop your AI, as you bring it into service. And I think that could really help in terms of mainstreaming ethical considerations across technology at the moment.
Fantastic. I could keep talking to you forever, but time, as ever, is with these fascinating conversations is against us. Kate, firstly, thank you so much for the work that you do, because I think as has become apparent, I think it's fascinating from an intellectual perspective, but really, really important. And we started talking about the metaverse, and we've moved into all sorts of other areas, many of which are, influencing our daily lives, but invisible to us. And so I think it's fascinating to just stop and think about all these things and then recognize where things will naturally go if we don't have these discussions. I will put links to you and some of the papers you've written in the show notes so people can find that and get hold of you if they want to have further discussions. But I'll say thank you so much for being a fabulous guest on the show.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Christian. Really enjoyed it.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Kate for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Kate and her research and some of the topics that we discussed on the show, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If you're interested in how the metaverse and other emerging technologies are relevant to compliance and risk, do get in touch. I've got an interesting project that's going to be launching very soon that's going to help you demystify it and work out what you need to do to get up to speed with them. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To find out more about human risk and the work that I do with my clients in helping them mitigate theirs, visit human-risk.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, thanks for listening, and look out for those bits of emerging tech. They're great, but they also pose quite a lot of risk. Thanks for listening.